choir chimes today. Mr. Malta chose to have 90-degree angles on each end of the chime so that there was only one vibrating surface on each side, and therefore it was a sound that had less overtones or less extraneous higher pitches in the sound, so that the sound was purer. Does anyone have any questions about basic chime design?
I do not see anybody.
Okay, great.
Question.
Okay, so the design of a basic D5 is just like that of a D3. The only difference is its size. But I will point out that the lower we go in with choir chime instruments, the larger the slot is and the more space between the two tines. And therefore, the larger or lower that we go, the chime is more fragile. Alrighty, a D7 chime is much more hardier than a D3 chime. And that is because the tines can bend very easily because of the gap between the two, because of the slot is wider between the two tines. Alrighty, today we have an example of our lower bass chimes starting with the 5th octave. There are some chimes missing there. We welcome Robert Lamb, who's demonstrating. So the lower 5th octave chime comes with a clapper attached. Most of the time they're rung by hand. However, some organizations do choose to purchase the optional rack. If perhaps it's children, sometimes they'll use a rack if the chimes are a little too large to ring and also damp. So we do have the 5th octave that has clappers and the optional rack. The lower 6th octave, which is G2 to B2, is next to the 5th octave. And these chimes, the chimes here with us today, do not have clappers. Clappers are optional on the lower 6th octave so that you can use them only in a rack or you can ring them as well. So the clappers are available at an additional cost. And then finally, the lower 7th octave, they are not available with clappers, and they are only held in a rack and struck with a mallet. So we have different mallets as well for these choir chime instruments. Going back to the lower 5th octave, we suggest our MH8 mallet for that. And you'll notice on the clapper head of the chime, it's very similar to that of the MH8 mallet. So we do recommend that the MH8 mallet is used on the lower 5th octave, C3 to F sharp 3, as well as the lower 6th octave, G2 to B2. There's quite a difference in size between the G2 and the B2 chime tubes, and so we do need that a little bit firmer core in the MH8 mallet to get a good resonant sound. Then finally, in the lower 7th octave, we do suggest the lamb's wool mallet, the MH5 mallet. Okay, is everybody good with that? Before we move on, we're going to talk a little bit about the chime racks. Yes, I'll lower it a little bit. You will notice when Robert strikes, how about the lower 7th octave, Robert? When Robert strikes the chimes, there's a little give in the chime rack, a little bit of motion. And that's there for a reason. There is a little give designed into the chime rack so that the chime rack is not the chime tube is not stationary and will take a stronger impact from the mallet strike. However, The chime racks do give a little bit, however, but there should not be a wavy motion when striking the chimes. They should be struck really, really lightly, about 2 inches from the top of the chime tube. I like to tell my ringers if they strike it. Now, obviously, Robert is that you can hear the chime. If you can hear the chime while you're ringing it, then you're striking it too hard. These are not meant to produce volume. They produce resultants. Does anyone have any questions about that so far?
I do not see any hands.
Great. Okay, let's talk a little bit about damping very quickly. When you, we're going to be talking about doubling down today, and the rule of thumb for chimes and doubling down is you can never just play an octave below a pitch. There always has to have something in between. So a C2 cannot be under a C3 without something in the middle. You always need a sandwich, all right? So we only have 2 arms, we have 1 player, and so in this case, maybe Robert is going to go from C2 and G2 to D2 and A2. He is going to use the mallet head to also damp the chime. Okay, so with the ringing, you never want to be late in striking the chimes on the next chord. But with the larger chimes, when they are damped, it takes a little bit for the total sound to go away. So it's better if they're damped prematurely to move on to the next beat. So I'm going to say, let's say we're in 4/4 and Robert is striking on beat 1 in each measure. So here we go, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So he damps a little bit before beat 1 so that he can get ringing on beat 1. Everybody good with that? Okay. Any questions, Yosung?
No, just thumbs up.
Thumbs up? Okay, very good. Alrighty, so we mentioned earlier, the lower you go, the more fragile the chimes are. So we mentioned that they are fragile because of the distance between the 2 times, the larger slot. I'm going to invite Hyosung to come over from the other room, and we're going to give you some examples of some resultant ringing with the chimes. Okay. So we are ringing a range of from C2 to C7 today. I'm going to move the screen around. Since I lost my moderator, can everyone see okay? Yes? Okay, so if you'll all stand up. So we're going to start by ringing a C major chord with C4 as the root. Alrighty, so it's just C4 up to C7. C4 is the bottom chime. Everybody good? Here we go, bell chimes up. Ready, 3, 4. Okay, Sam is in the back, and I'm going to invite him to add C3 below the C4. Excuse me? Can everyone hear? Okay, I'm going to invite Sam to ring C3 under the C4 chord. Here we go. Ready, go. Okay, it sounds great, but these larger chimes do not create volume. They work on resultants. And so now I'm going to invite Sam to add the G3 in with the C major chord of C3, G3, C4, and et cetera, et cetera. Ready? Here we go. And we're going back without the C3. Here we go. Ready, ring. And again, Sam's adding in this G3. So by that, you can hear that there is a fullness added when the G3 is added between the C3 and the C4. Therefore, because of the depth that is added by adding the fifth or some type of inversion in the middle of the two, we get a richer sound without having to strike too hard. We're going to continue with that, and we're now going to add in C2 with Robert. And here we go. Ready, ring. And that's a lovely sound, but now I'll invite Robert to add the G2 in. Ready, go. And again, you can hear the sound is much richer, it's much louder when we have the fifth in there. Now, not all chords are written in root positions. So C, E, G obviously is a C major chord. Sometimes there may be a C3 at the bottom of a chord, but it's actually an F major chord in the 6/4 inversion, which I'm going to invite them to ring right now. So before you add this C, yes, you can, Sam, you can ring it all, okay? And Robert, if you'll wait for a sec, here we go. Ready, ring. Okay, again, this is an F major chord with C3 as the root. It's a 6/4 inversion. Now we would double down because C is the root of that chord in our particular piece. And Robert will add it. Here we go. 3, 4. What happens with that is I get a little bit more C and I'm not hearing the tonic, and I'm inviting Robert now to add the F2 in with the C2. Ready, go, and. Okay, and you can hear that it's a much fuller sound by having something in between the octave. So that is the true rule of doubling down with chimes. You'll find if you have something between the two octave notes, you will have a much richer tone, and your bass chime ringers should not be having to strike the chimes in the recs as hard as they are, causing the tine to bend in and then cracking the tube. Hyosung. So Hyosung is going back to her station, and we will talk a little bit about doubling down and the score. Before we do that, I just want to make sure that no one has any questions with regard to doubling down in the score. You all can sit. Thank you. That was beautiful. Okay, are there any questions?
It looks like Greg might have one.
Greg.
So we came upon this when we're kind of I feel like a lot of handbell compositions aren't actually written with the lower rack of chimes written in them, and we're adding them in. And how it gets a little dicey, maybe this goes like a little too deep into music theory, so feel free to cut it off. You have a chord but your bass line is changing, right? So you start with a C and then there's a C over B to get to an A. How do you follow that with trying to add the fifths in between, right? Because if you start on a C chord with a C and a G, and then your bass line moves down to like a B flat, over
Okay,
chords.
I'm going to be getting to that, Greg, in our second example, how we have a moving line within the bass. So if you don't mind being patient, but you said the magic word there, that you definitely have to be theory oriented sometimes to double down. I would really encourage directors to be serious about doing assignments and doing doublings before you put a score in front of your choir. Because it will make or break, and unfortunately it's breaking a lot of large chimes, but it will make or break how the instruments are being used, and it's important that, that we do have something in between the octaves. Before we move on, I failed to mention one thing about the larger chime. Oh, I'll leave. Just remind me about times afterwards. Okay, time protectors. We're going to move to a score now. I chose this lovely arrangement of the Welsh of a Welsh folk tune. You also know it as the name Suagon, okay? And I first heard this tune, I'm dating myself, but it was in the movie Empire of the Sun, and it was sung by a lovely voice soprano. And Maggie Tucker arranged this tune back in the 90s. And this is the type of piece that I look towards for ringing all on chimes, okay? Number one, the tempo marking. The tempo marking is very important. It's only quarter note to 64. The second thing that is so important about this is that there aren't any stopped sounds in this. Now, of course, you can always take a score and not do the ringing articulations. You can just ring the notes if you're using it on chimes, because we are finding more and more, you know, it's not good to use the martellato technique on chimes because it just causes the tine to bend in and crack your tube. So I'll ask Hyosung to scroll up the page just very slowly to page 3, Hyosung, please. There we go, back down. Okay, so this is the first example. It's an unmarked score. And you'll see in the handbell's use chart eventually that there are no, I believe there are very few bell changes as well. So this is a wonderful piece to use if you are just getting chimes and you want to get your choir used to using them. So I'll ask Hyosung now to scroll down ahead to page 5. And I've added some notes in red, starting at measure 9. I thought that you can, and this is how I look at a score and think about doubling down. You can see in the first 8 measures, it's all up above the 2-octave range. And so finally at 9, we start to get that low LV bass. And so I want to double down to fill in the harmony. What I've done is looked at measure 9 to see that we are in C major there. So I've added a whole note C3 and a whole note G3. In measure 10, you can see that our harmony changes by looking at the arpeggio in the bass. We have a C4, A4, C5 back to A4. So I have kept my C3 whole note. I now have an A3 half note ringing on beat 1, and then back to C major on beat 3, I have a G3. Now, I could have written 2 half notes on beat 1, C3 and A3, and then 2 half notes on beat 3, C3 and G3. But there is no reason to with chimes. We want them to sustain as long as possible. That half note really isn't the best thing for them, so I always want to use the longest note that I possibly can get away with. So instead of doing 2 half notes in the C3, I did a whole note C3, and then going back to measure 11, I have a whole note C3 and a whole note G3. Going on to measure 14, Okay, we're back to the way we were the measure before. We have the A3 on beat 1, the G3 on beat 3 with a whole note C3. Now what I did at measure 13, going from a C3 up to a C5 is a little drastic for me. I like to have a stepping stone in between. So what I did is just created a drone in measures 13, 14, and 15. And then measure 16 gives a little bit of a break before we go back to the C3 and the G3. I think a lot of times what I hear choirs doing is that they would play a C3 in measure 17 without the G3, and they would play a C3 in 18 without the A3 and the G3, especially because the harmony changes between beats 2 and 3. However, that is basically giving us a watered down version of the full chord. And so again, we go back to the rule, you always have to have something between the octaves. Does anyone have any questions about this? Is it clear, friends, where my thought process is in adding in the chimes? Yes? Okay, so I'm going to invite Hyosung to go back to page 3, and she will now play a recording of this piece on chimes, okay?
Can anyone hear it? Not yet? Okay, hold on. Sorry about that. I'll try that again.
But those are beautiful sound waves, Hyosung. May we see the spread? Okay, Hyosung, we're gonna, great, thank you. So that's just the sweetest, most wonderful arrangement by Maggie Tucker. And frankly, I look for pieces like that, that I can extend the range of the chimes and make little masterpieces with them. Takes a lot of sensitivity, especially with chimes, because they don't often have the nuance that bells do to ring them musically. And oftentimes we have to do it through dynamics or rubato or stretching out or cello rondo just to give it a little bit more musical taste. A lot of times we think that chimes, remember chimes were invented to be a training instrument for young children before they moved on to handbells. But when the ringing community heard them, we had other ideas about that. So we love to ring them and it's great, but remember that they cannot replace and they cannot do everything that a handbell can. Want to invite Robert up because I failed to mention something earlier about the chimes when I was talking about the chimes and the cases and the racks. And that is that your chimes come with these tine protectors. It's very important that if you are a traveling choir, if you go outside, if you're a church choir, but you do a lot of gigs, you want to make sure that you use the chime protectors when you carry the chimes in their case. If you're a community group, I know that you're out concertizing a lot and you want to be sure to use the tine protectors. That will help. Even if someone drops a case, it can cause the tines to bend a little bit. So it's really important that you use those protectors. Now, if you have a chime that has bent tines already and you try to put your tine protector in and it's a little difficult, I would recommend that you don't force it. You don't force it because you will probably cause the tines to crack a little bit quicker, okay? So a good test for me, occasionally when we're packing up, I'll use the tine protectors just to make sure that our chimes are in good shape, that we don't have any tines bent in. So that's a good way of checking on the physical health of your chimes. Friends, I like to address handbells almost like a string quartet. All right, so I always like to say I would never have the violin part play on the string bass. Okay, it can't because the sound doesn't move fast enough. Well, the same thing rings true with these larger chimes. They are great for whole notes. They are great for half notes. They are not designed to ring quarter notes. And the reason for that is the vibration mode is so slow that if you strike between or during that vibration, it will weaken the metal. It will weaken the tines and it will cause the tine to crack. So if you have four G3 quarter notes in a row, I would not suggest that you play the G2 and the D3 for 4 quarter notes. You can very easily play the G3 and the D3 as a whole note and have the upper notes do the quarter notes and the music will sound great. In fact, we're going to do that as an experiment. How's that? Okay, how about a G major chord? I'll jump in here with my gloves. Okay, so we're just, without Robert, we're going to ring just 4, how about 8 quarter notes? Ready? 3, 4. Now we invite Robert to join us. Oh, still ring the quarter notes. And Sam, you don't have a D3. I do. Here you go. Sorry, I went off script here. And if you'll add that in with Robert. So we'll do 4 quarter notes and invite Robert and Sam to join us. Sorry, Robert. There you go. Ready, ring. Okay, so that's definitely how I would handle doubling down when you have an active bass line. Before we move on, are there any questions?
I do not see any hands.
Okay, I'm going to invite Hyosung to pull up our second musical example. I can't take off my mask, sorry. You guys can sit, thank you. Okay, so friends, the first musical example that we shared with you was how you take just a score that's maybe written for 3 octaves or 5 octaves and how you can add your lower instruments in and add them in. The second score that I'm going to ask Hyosung to bring up is page 7, Hyosung. Aha, here we go. All right, and I'm not going to name this composition, the composer or the publisher, as to not embarrass them. But this is example of using a lower 7th octave chime set and not doing it well because there's nothing between the octaves. So we're going to start out not at measure 10, but at measure 11, all right? And you'll see that the E3 and E2 are written in 11 on beat 1. On beat 4, the bottom 2 notes are C2 and C3. In measure 12, the bottom 2 notes are D2 and D3. 13, we have E's, F's, and G's, okay? And 14, we have E's and F's. Does everybody get the idea of what's going on? Yes, thumbs up? Okay, so this bothers me because we won't get the resonance that we need coming from these lower chimes. Again, they don't produce sound, but they create resultance. And they need something between the octave. So I'm going to ask Hyosung to scroll up to page 8. And we're going to start by looking at measure 11 because I'm going to get back to 10 and answer Greg's question in a second. But here we go. In 11, on beat 1, I have added the B flat 2. Okay, on beat 4, I have added the G2. On beat 12, I have added the, what did I add in there? The A2. Okay, thank you, Robert. And then here in 13, I had a terrible glare going on. Okay, so 13, then we have the B flat, and the C and the D. Okay, now, so you'll see that throughout pretty much I've added the dominant, the 5th in the chords, because most of them are not inversions, okay? But let's take a look at measure 10. And Greg, I think this answers your question. I wrote it a little bit differently. So you'll see that the G2 should be the bass for 9 beats. So just for notation purposes, I drew in a dotted quarter note on beat 4 and tied it to the dotted quarter note on beat 7. All right, so we're gonna have the G2 ringing for 9 beats, as well as the G3 ringing for 9 beats. And then, because we have the harmony changing over those 3 dotted quarter notes, I've added in the D and the E and back down to the D.
This is pretty boring, isn't it?
So rather than putting in dotted quarter notes for G2 and G3, I'm keeping them whole and just moving the harmony. And that would be key, I would say. If you can, once you strike a chime, let it ring until the harmony changes. Are there any questions?
I don't think I see any hands.
No questions?
I put a question in the chat. Was it easier for me to just repeat it?
Sure.
My question was, is it typically okay with the publishers and composers for us to double down, or do we need to ask?
Ask permission. Okay, that's a good question. I guess because Don Alured was my teacher back at Westminster Choir College in the 80s, and we were one of the first 7-octave sets of bells. He just took the liberty to double down because we had the instruments and there was very little written for 7 octaves. And I can't speak for every composer and arranger, but I've never met one who didn't love the bass, the added bass in their piece. So I don't think it is necessary unless there's someone in the house right now that is a composer or an editor that would like to respond to that.
Thank you. That's the answer I was hoping to hear.
Okay, Becky, go. I'm going to say go for it. All righty.
Okay, thank you.
I would say if I purchased the piece that I, gave you as an example right now without the added fifths, I would definitely add them in. I was looking through a lot of music over the past couple of days, and as the new releases were coming out, and noticing so many lower 6th and 7th octave chimes being used with nothing in between the octaves, that I'm actually going to just send my class notes out to the editors, because we don't want to crack. The instruments are too expensive, $760. I gulp every time someone has to replace one. So I don't want to see you have to replace your chimes. So I think I'll send a little note out to the editors just going forward. Maybe they can watch the music that they edit. Greg.
Yeah, as a arranger of stuff, I think it depends on how it's done, right? And it sounds like I heard something of like a lot of the groups that have the capability to add on the 7th octaves usually are at the level where they have enough music theory knowledge to do it well, and maybe some artistic kind of judgment to also do it in appropriate places. They're not just going to add the 7th octave for every piece they do the entire way through because they can. They're hopefully going to do it well. And so often composers might write kind of that 3 to 5 octave version, knowing that a group that has the 6th or 7th octave of bells or chimes is going to figure that out on their own, and they're going to add their own part. And if it's specifically written for that 7th octave, then they're going to be very specific about it. Now, it sounds like some people aren't as good as others, but that's kind of the lay of the land.
Yeah, and I will also mention that there are some publishers who don't print digitally. And so it is not cost effective to print a 7-octave piece. We know that 85% of our choirs ring between 3 and 5 octaves. And so they always will publish the 3 to 5 version, and some of them won't touch a 6th or 7th octave version just because of the cost per, it's expensive to put it in print and then not sell it. If that makes sense. And Greg, you brought up a good point. I've been to a couple performances recently where choirs had invested in their 6th and 7th chime rack and used it on every single piece. And so I kind of approach a large set of bells as I would a pipe organ. I don't think I would want to go to an organ recital with all of the ranks being used on every single piece. We need variety. The listening ear needs variety. But I also think that these instruments, the lower instruments especially, are exceptional, and they need to be used where they're used best and not on every piece. Just my opinion, just my 2 cents. Okay, are there any questions, comments, anything else we can help out with today? If you were here in Plumsteadville, we would be giving you door prizes, so I'm so sorry that,
Kathy, Larry has a question.
Okay.
Thank you. So does this work on all chord inversions?
It does.
Okay.
It does indeed. Any other questions?
I do not see any hands.
Okay, friends, and the showcase information, the class notes with the musical scores, just 2 pages of the 4-piece score of a Welsh folk song are there for download, as well as the piece of, you know, adding the 5th in on the piece that was already written for C2, C3 without a note in between. So please feel free to download those notes and keep them there. There's also our downloadable care and maintenance manual for bass chimes is available. If you have a problem downloading, please feel free to call us at 1-800-HANDBELL. Our current hours are Monday through Thursday. We are not open on Fridays during this COVID time, but you can reach us from 8 to 5 Daylight Savings Time. And also, we are in our booth until 7 o'clock today, and we will be there tomorrow from 9 to 5, so please stop in, say hello. We are offering a 10% discount on all instruments.
Kathy,
Yes.
one thing I do want to mention, at the beginning you were talking about the lower 6 with or without the clappers.
Yes, Leslie.
Something that for people to keep in mind is if you order the ones without the clappers and then later decide you want to add them, the case that they come in without the clappers doesn't work unless you specifically ask, because the case is actually smaller without the clappers, which I like because it fits better in the space we have available to move stuff.
Okay, that's a good point, Leslie. Thank you. I missed that point. So yes, if you are about to invest on a lower 6th octave, G2 to B2, know when you purchase whether or not you want clappers. It's I'm sorry, not $1, $165 per chime to add the clapper assembly. I will be honest, because I have one of the first sets of the lower 6th octave chimes. I have clappers, but we hardly ever ring them. We use them in the rack most of the time. So think twice about spending that extra $165. I don't sound much like a salesperson here, do I? But anyway, I'm just telling you folks that I don't think they're worth it, because you can use them with the rack.
And if you don't use the racks, if you need to play them an odd one here and there, there's almost always somebody that can grab it and have a mallet to hold it and play it. And the other thing, I have actually seen where the ones with the clappers, somebody gets too carried away, and we actually have the tines almost together by the time the clapper is hit. They've come with so much force with trying to ring it with the clapper on it.
Okay, good deal. Any other questions or comments today, friends? Okay, well, I'm going to have everybody here in Plumsteadville wave goodbye. We thank you. We appreciate your use of Malmark instruments, and we wish you all peace and good health. Bye.